The year was 1979, and the rain fell like a curtain across the empty streets. David Lawson sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, its engine coughing, wheezing, and then giving up entirely just outside the gates of St. Catherine's Orphanage. He slammed his palm gently against the steering wheel and let out a long sigh. Another broken-down evening in a life that already felt cracked. 2 years had passed since Margaret, his beloved wife, had been taken from him. The cancer had been cruel, robbing her of her warmth, her smile, her future, and his too. The house they once dreamed of filling with children now echoed with silence, each room colder than the last. David was only 34, but his heart felt ancient. Friends told him to move on, to remarry, to try again. But he couldn't, not with the promise he had made. He remembered it as if it had happened that morning. Margaret lying pale in her hospital bed, her hand clutching his. "Don't let love die with me," she had whispered through trembling lips. "Give it somewhere to go." That promise followed him everywhere. Through sleepless nights, through quiet suppers alone, through the aching hollowness of a house too big for one man. And now, soaked to the bone, he stepped into the orphanage only to borrow their phone, only to call for a tow truck. But sometimes life has other plans. As he waited in the dim hallway, a sound floated toward him, faint, fragile like the whimper of a bird. Crying. He turned the corner and stopped. There, in a cramped little room, stood 9 cribs side by side. And in each crib a tiny baby girl. 9 of them. All with dark, curled hair and small brown hands gripping thin blankets. A young nurse stood nearby, her expression weary but tender. "They came together," she said softly, noticing his puzzled stare. "Found them on the church steps one winter night. No names, no notes. We think they're sisters. Or at least meant to stay together. But..." She hesitated. "No one wants them all. People come asking for 1 or 2. The rest will be separated." That word struck him like a stone to the chest. Separated. His heart clenched as he looked at the cribs. So small, so helpless, already facing a life of being torn apart. He thought of Margaret's voice again. "Give it somewhere to go." As if on cue, one of the babies reached out a tiny hand and clutched his sleeve. Another gazed up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Eyes that felt impossibly familiar, as though he had known her in another life. In that instant, the silence inside him cracked, and something warm rushed in. "What if," he murmured almost to himself, "what if someone took them all?" The nurse's head jerked up. "All 9? Sir, that's impossible. No man can raise 9 babies alone." David swallowed hard. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was madness. He was just a mechanic with a house too big and a heart too empty. But as he stood among those cribs, he felt Margaret there, whispering again, "Don't let love die with me." That night, he didn't just borrow the phone. He signed his name. The weeks that followed were a storm of paperwork, questions, and disbelief. Social workers frowned. Neighbors whispered. "What's a white man doing with 9 black babies?" some muttered. "He's lost his mind," others sneered. But David didn't flinch. He sold his truck, his tools, even the last of Margaret's jewelry. He worked double shifts at the mill, patched roofs on weekends, washed dishes in the diner at night. Every dollar went to diapers, bottles, formula, and tiny clothes that filled the washing line like bright flags of hope. And when the day finally came, when the papers were stamped and the judge nodded gravely, David Lawson drove home not with silence, but with 9 fragile lives bundled in blankets. That first night was chaos. Bottles boiled on the stove. Cries rose like sirens in every room. He forgot to eat, forgot to sleep. By dawn, his shirt was damp with spit up and his hands trembled as he counted heads again and again. 1, 2, 3, 9. Always 9. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. A faint, flickering warmth he hadn't felt in years. Life. The beginning of a promise kept. As the rain cleared outside, David Lawson stood in the doorway of his once empty home and whispered to the morning light. "All right, Margaret. Here we go." The early years were a storm, louder, messier, and far more exhausting than David Lawson ever imagined. His once quiet home was now a battleground of crying and cooing, with 9 little voices demanding everything all at once. There were bottles to warm, diapers to change, and tiny socks that always disappeared. Sleep became a stranger. Meals were often cold or skipped entirely. But in that whirlwind, something beautiful began to take root. Neighbors gossiped. Some crossed the street to avoid him, shaking their heads. "What's he trying to prove?" they said. 9 babies, and none of them his own. Madness. There were harsher words too. Ugly whispers about race, about why a white man would choose to raise 9 black girls. But David had stopped listening. His world was measured not in approval or opinion, but in heartbeats and lullabies. Money was the constant enemy. He sold the last of his comforts. His old truck, his workshop tools, even the set of fishing rods he once shared with Margaret on sunny afternoons. He worked until his hands cracked, until his back ached too much to stand. Day shifts at the mill, odd jobs on rooftops and fences, late-night dishwashing at the diner. Every dollar was stretched until it nearly tore. The girls never saw the bills piling on the kitchen table. They only saw their father's tired smile. David learned new things: how to braid hair for school mornings, how to sew tiny dresses with crooked stitches, how to cook 9 portions with 1 bag of rice. He learned to sing lullabies softly, one by one, until the whole house fell asleep. And in that quiet, he would sit in the darkness, counting breaths in the cribs around him, afraid that his strength might fail before theirs had a chance to grow. But the girls grew anyway. There was Elena, the one with the loudest laugh, who always tried to stand first in line for hugs. Naomi and Esther, mischievous twins in everything but birth, partners in every secret. Ruth, shy and watchful, already carrying wisdom beyond her years. Miriam, quiet but brave, the first to take a wobbly step toward him across the kitchen floor. Hannah, Rachel, Leah, and tiny Grace, the youngest, always trailing behind the others, her giggle like a bell in the wind. They became known around town as the Lawson 9. Some people smiled at the sight of them, others looked away. But the girls didn't care. To them, this man who came home smelling of sweat and sawdust was not strange. He was simply Dad. The hardest years weren't just about money. They were about proving love where the world doubted it. There were nights when David went without supper so the girls could eat, mornings when he wore the same patched shirt to keep them warm. There were winters when the heater broke, and they all slept huddled together under 3 blankets, breath turning to clouds in the air. Yet there were also miracles. The first time they all laughed at once, their tiny hands clutching his sleeves during thunderstorms, Christmas mornings where gifts were wrapped in newspaper but opened with joy, birthdays with lopsided cakes that collapsed in the middle but tasted like heaven anyway. Each sacrifice turned into a memory. Each struggle wove another thread between them. By the time the girls reached their teenage years, the house was never quiet. There were arguments over bathroom mirrors, giggles past midnight, music that rattled the windows. David, now graying at the temples, sometimes stood in the doorway just to watch them. 9 girls who had once been 9 nameless infants, now filling the house with noise, with chaos, with life. There were still whispers in town, still doubts from those who didn't understand. But regret never came. Instead, there was something deeper, pride and a promise slowly coming true. Time flowed like a slow, steady river, carrying David Lawson from the man he was to the man he had become. His hair turned gray, his hands grew rougher, and his back bent from years of hard work. The once noisy house slowly emptied as each of the 9 girls, his daughters by choice, not by blood, grew into strong, remarkable women. Elena became a teacher who lit up the lives of hundreds of children. Naomi and Esther, the mischievous pair, opened a little bakery where the smell of fresh bread spilled out into the streets each morning. Ruth, once shy and quiet, wrote her first book and saw her name printed proudly on the cover. Miriam trained as a nurse, steady and calm, always the first to help. Hannah, Rachel, and Leah found their passions in music, law, and business. And little Grace, the tiniest of them all, became a teacher, just like the stories David used to read to her at night. The years brought their own trials. Illnesses, heartbreaks, lost jobs, new beginnings, but the Lawson 9 always came home. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving they returned, their laughter spilling down the hallways, their memories stitched into the very walls that had raised them. Then came the day David feared and cherished all at once. The house was quiet again. Grace, the last to leave, kissed him on the cheek and whispered, "I'll come back, Dad. We all will." And she did, just like the others. Decades passed, and now it was the year 2025. David Lawson, frail but still with a spark in his eyes, sat in a wide wooden chair in a hall filled with flowers, light, and cameras. 9 women in cream-colored dresses stood around him, their hands resting gently on his shoulders, their smiles shining for the world to see. Headlines read, "In 1979, he adopted 9 black baby girls. Today they stand together as women." But David didn't care about headlines. He didn't care about the crowd or the applause. His eyes saw only them, his daughters. The babies he once fed with trembling hands, the toddlers whose tears he wiped, the teenagers he worried over, the women who now stood as proof that his promise had not been in vain. Grace, the youngest, leaned close and whispered in his ear, "Dad, you did it. You kept us together." David's eyes filled with tears as a tired smile spread across his face. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We did it. Love did it." In that moment, the house that had once been silent was full again, not with crying, not with struggle, but with the sound of a promise kept. David Lawson closed his eyes for a brief second, feeling Margaret's presence in the warmth of the room. The promise he made to her in the quiet of a hospital room, all those years ago, had blossomed into life, into love, into a legacy. And for the first time in decades, David allowed the tears to fall, not from sorrow but from something deeper. Because love, when chosen and fought for, does not die. It multiplies.